Election season is in full swing. What do candidates need to do to get your vote? Teachers face a deadline regarding their union membership. Will there be many who opt out? Plus, Detroit's bankruptcy trial starts Tuesday. We'll take a look at the proceedings and the end of an era for the Detroit Police Department. Its analysis of news across the state. MiWeek starts now.
Recently, Michigan's economy has begun to turn around. Michigan's gained over 250,000 new jobs. We've paid off $20 billion in long-term debt. And our population is increasing for the first time in a decade. But to make Michigan a top 10 state, there's still plenty of work to be done. Step up and help put Michigan on top. Learn what you can do at MichiganTurnaroundPlan.com.
Funding is also provided by Delta.
Welcome to MiWeek. Thanks for joining us. I'm Michigan Radio's Jen White, sitting in for Christy McDonald. If you're counting, there's just 10 weeks until the November election. That means candidates across the state are ramping up their messaging and working to get your vote. What are the biggest hurdles to winning in November? The first day of school is almost here, but there's another deadline looming for teachers before they walk into the classroom. Plus, Detroit's bankruptcy trial is scheduled to start next Tuesday, but attorneys for both sides were in court this week. And the end of federal oversight for the Detroit Police Department. But we begin tonight with a look at the November elections. Campaigning is shifted into high gear. And here to discuss what candidates need to do to win, our MiWeek contributors, Ingrid Jacks, the deputy editorial page editor of Detroit News, and Stephen Henderson, the editorial page editor of the Detroit Free Press. Welcome to you both.
Well, welcome to you.
Oh, thank you. Thank
Sitting
you.
in for the first time.
A lot of fun to be here. A lot of fun to be here. So we're in full swing for the November elections. And you know, it's interesting because so far what I haven't heard a lot about are debates. So what are voters going to be basing their vote on when we're not hearing a lot about conversations actually happening between the candidates? Ingrid?
Well, that's a good question, and I would assume we'll start seeing some more debates start to get scheduled, but maybe not. I know Terry Lynn Land has not shown a lot of interest in debating Gary Peters, so I think she probably should step up and agree to that. I think he's expressed a willingness to do that, so we'll see what happens.
That's unusual for a Senate seat race. I would think, Stephen, that you don't have the two candidates debating each other.
Well, we didn't the last time either. The last time we had a Senate race, and that's a big problem here in the state. We let the politicians control this conversation and set the agenda with regard to debates, and so they manipulate the process such that it's to their advantage. If Terry Lynn Land doesn't think it's going to help her campaign to debate, there's no mechanism to force her to do that. I've been talking for a long time with, in fact, Nolan Finley, who's the editorial page editor at the News, about the possibility of wrenching that control away from politicians. Why don't we as the media all get together and schedule debates for statewide races every time? I doubt any candidate would feel comfortable opting out of that. But as long as we let them do it, we're going to have this kind of circus where candidates who just don't see any upside to debating are just never going to do it.
They'll just opt out. Yeah. Looking at the top of the ticket, we have a race right now between Governor Snyder and Mark Schauer, the Democratic candidate. And interestingly enough, a poll came out this week from Epic MRA that shows Mark Schauer slightly ahead of Governor Snyder in the polls. Now, we all know that relying too heavily on polls can cause you a bit of consternation in the long term. But I want to hear your feedback about that. How is that race shaping up in your view? Ingrid?
I think it's bizarre that it's as close as it is. That's definitely surprised us at the News anyway, that Schauer has been able to be so close, even coming ahead in this most recent poll. I think Governor Snyder has a lot to brag about in his work here the last 4 years, and Schauer, I don't think, has he's thrown out a lot of criticisms, but he hasn't really put out detailed plans as to what he would do. I'd like to start seeing more of that from him.
So what do you think voters are responding to in Mark Schauer?
Well, I'm not sure they're responding to Mark Schauer so much as they're responding to Rick Snyder. He's an unpopular incumbent. You look at some of the numbers in that poll, 57% of people think he's done a bad job as governor over the last
How can they think that,
4
though?
years. Well, I mean, I think look at some of the things that have happened. Right to work, I think that still is trailing behind him 2 years after it was done. Look at his involvement in some of the abortion issues that have come across his desk that he hasn't stood up to. Look at the campaign finance failures that he's indulged. I mean, there are he does have a lot of things, I think, to brag about in terms of turning the state's economy around, although we haven't grown jobs nearly as fast as he promised. And of course, the intervention in Detroit cuts both ways in the polls. I mean, some people think that was a great thing. Other people are not so happy about it. So this is about the governor more than it is about Schauer, who I think has yet to really define himself in a way that voters could even get behind. We also haven't really seen the governor campaign that much yet. You know, once he gets out and starts putting his message out and really attacking Schauer, I don't know how those numbers may change.
When we think about what voters are looking for, it seems at the top of that list would be infrastructure. They want people in office who are going to fix the roads. As someone who replaced 3 tires this winter, I understand that desire.
I think we've all had those.
Yeah, yeah. So, you know, what are those top issues in voters' minds? Infrastructure, what else, Ingrid?
Well, I think that's definitely a top, and Governor Snyder certainly tried to keep that conversation going in the legislature with getting more money for roads. That's one of the things he wasn't able to get done. He crossed off a lot of other things on his list, but I do believe that's going to be one of the top issues.
What about social issues? You know, Stephen, you mentioned some of the abortion laws that have come up. Go ahead.
Sorry, just to jump in here, but interestingly enough, Mark Schauer is kind of in some hot water right now because, you know, speaking of the war on women that Republicans are often accused of, he endorsed basically a pro-life judge for the Supreme Court, and I think that's kind of an interesting turn of events. Nolan Finley wrote about that today in the Detroit News, but we'll see how if that backfires on him at all.
Yeah, Stephen?
Yeah, I think the governor has the same problem that you see with Republican governors in other sort of bluish states, in that that's where he is most out of sync with the residents here. I mean, and really, you know,
out of sync with his party too.
Out of sync with his party. I mean, he's sort of in an odd position because I don't think Rick Snyder is a terribly socially conservative Republican.
No, he's not a big social issue.
But he hasn't stood up to a legislature that is full of really radical lawmakers who have put some things on his desk that I think most voters think he should have vetoed, or at least asked for changes before he signed them. And he has shown himself sort of unwilling or unable to do that enough times that I think voters are starting to question whether he's in control or whether you really have this sort of Tea Party influenced legislature that is running the state.
And when we look at how the elections roll out, it'll be interesting to see how the balance of power shifts even within the Republican Party itself, whether you end up with more Tea Party Republicans taking seats or whether you have more of the fiscal, traditional conservative Republicans who are holding on to power, and that's something Governor Snyder's going to have to figure out how to negotiate long term.
Well, he also has to start articulating how the next 4 years might look different from the last 4 in that regard. Is something he hasn't addressed at all. And in fact, he hasn't really said what he wants to do in the next 4 years. Not that Mark Schauer has been a whole lot more prescriptive about that, but both of them, I think, have to define themselves a lot better for voters before November.
Well, moving on, Labor Day weekend is almost here, and that means the end of summer vacation and back to school. But before everyone walks into the classroom, there's another deadline looming, August 31st. That's the date teachers need to decide if they will remain in their union or opt out. Both organized labor and pro-business groups are lobbying teachers in what many say is the first real litmus test of the state's right to work law. I want to come to you first, Ingrid, because it's interesting in this campaign really led by the Mackinac Center saying, we want to make sure teachers are informed that they have this option to opt out on August 31st. The MEA came back and said, that's been there for a long time. That's not news to teachers. How much of this is about giving teachers options and how much of it is just politics?
Well, I think the MEA is saying that teachers should have known about this August opt-out window, but the truth is a lot of teachers didn't know about that. And last year, the first year that some teachers were able to exercise their right to work rights, they didn't realize they only had that limited window, and of course the MEA wasn't reminding teachers of that.
Which they say, what organization reminds people that they
you can leave.
Well, no,
Right.
that's true, but at the same time, the teachers that did try to leave last year, even wrote letters to MEA administrators saying they wanted out, say in July of last year. It's been a real battle for them, and the ones that didn't pay their dues because they thought they were out, the MEA went after their credit ultimately. So I think we'll see quite a few more teachers exercising that right this month. Don't really have a good feel for how many, but I think it's about 60% of teachers are now under contract subject to right to work. So there's a lot more that have that option this year than even last year.
But even without the opt-out, the MEA has been facing this issue of teachers not paying dues because they can't take those dues directly from their paychecks anymore.
Right.
And that's really hit them in their coffers.
Well, and that's what's behind this, really. I mean, this is not about freedom to choose what organization you belong to and the kind of things that we've heard from the Republican legislature. It's about knocking the legs out from under a reliable Democratic supporting institution. And so taking that money, taking the ability away from them to get their dues out of people's checks, giving people the option to not belong even though they would end up having the same protections as the people who are paying. That's what's behind this. This is about politics. This is about trying to solidify Republican strength, particularly fundraising strength in Michigan. And so now you see the MEA having to fight that battle.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I think that's true politically, but there are also a lot of teachers that just don't want to be in the union. They don't like a lot of the political work that the union does. They don't agree with that, and they'd really just assume not pay those $1,000 dues every year. And I think they should have that opportunity. I mean, one of the biggest criticisms I hear when I write about this issue from teachers is they don't appreciate that these people who opt out of the union can still benefit from
freeloading.
Well, but under Michigan law, which is a separate law from right to work, teachers cannot represent themselves under Michigan law, and that's something that probably should change because that fairness issue makes sense to me. But right now, a teacher who opts out is still represented by the union. They don't have an option.
How important is this fight within the larger context of union membership in the state? We have UAW contracts coming up for renewal next year. I mean, if we see this mass exodus of teachers from the MEA, is that an alarm bell that goes off for other unions?
I think it would be. I mean, I don't expect to see that. I think most teachers, even if they have problems with their union, would rather be members than not. And so I don't expect to see a bunch of people leaving. But I think all unions in the state, because of this the new reality of right to work, have more of a sell job to do. Right? They have to justify to their members why they ought to be members, and I'm not sure that's such a bad thing. I mean, I think
I think it's a good thing.
That's right. They ought to have to show what benefits people get. I happen to think there are a lot of benefits that people get from union membership, and certainly if you go back in history to before teachers and other kinds of public sector workers in particular were unionized, and it was pretty bleak, in terms of their benefits, in terms of their retirements, and so the unions do play an important role, and now they've got to sell that. But yeah, you would if you had a mass exodus of teachers from the union, it would absolutely sound alarm bells in other unions about people maybe rethinking that.
I wonder if this potentially could backfire on some of the pro-business groups who are pushing for this opt-out, and that it could make people think, well, why is it so important to you that I'm not a part of a union? And maybe I need to really look at what this union is doing for me, and it really does force unions to make that case for why membership is important. Could we see that kind of backlash?
I think, let's say, the Mackinac Center has led the biggest effort to just get the word out to teachers. I wouldn't say they're trying to encourage teachers to opt out, but
the teachers might disagree with that.
Well, but there's not a lot of information coming from anywhere else to help teachers know how. It's not necessarily obvious. A lot of teachers just don't know where to go. But the MEA is definitely trying to scare might be too strong a word, but teachers that do go to the MEA saying, hey, how do we do this? They're given this form from the MEA, 2-page form checklist that teachers don't have to sign to opt out, but they're being told that they do from the MEA. Basically, it's a list of 25 benefits that they're giving up by leaving the union. So the MEA is really trying to make teachers think about leaving before they do.
Well, they should. I mean, they should. There's no question that there are benefits that accrue to teachers because of
But if teachers
union
leave,
membership.
they could always join again if they really feel like they're losing out.
They could, but the issue is the financial support for the union to provide those protections gets eroded when when people leave.
Well, I think it goes back to the MEA is going to have to do a better job selling to teachers what it does versus just trying to scare people into not leaving. That's not a really good strategy.
Come August 31st, we'll have a sense of, or shortly thereafter, we'll have a sense of who's made maybe the stronger case.
Yeah.
Well, let's move on. Detroit's bankruptcy trial is scheduled to start next Tuesday, September 2nd. Earlier this week, lawyers for the city and bond insurer Syncora were in court arguing over the grand bargain. Judge Rhodes said he would rule on that matter before the trial starts. A bit of a Hail Mary pass this week from Syncora and another creditor. There's this offer of a $4 billion loan to Detroit, and what they're requesting as collateral is the DIA. It just feels at this point that these creditors are kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall hoping something,
What do they have
something
to lose?
sticks. Well, right. What's at risk for these creditors?
Well, losing out completely. And Syncora has said they're at risk of going bankrupt themselves if they lose out here, and they're trying to make the case that retirees have gotten, they've been treated too partially in these proceedings with the grand bargain, and so they're going to, Syncora and the other creditors, they're going to do what they can to try to come out ahead here, but I don't think that argument's going to gain much traction.
Well, it's an absurd proposal. It's saying you're $18 billion in debt and you can't pay that.
Have an answer.
So here's the solution. Let's give you $4 billion more that you can't afford to pay back, and as collateral, we'll just hold on to the deed to your art museum. And by the way, the pensioners that you've made such an effort to protect from the devastating impact of this, they won't get any more. It absolutely destroys all of the principles that were behind this grand bargain, and I think the judge has signaled enough times about short-term fixes, things that make the situation worse for the city in the long run, that they will not be countenanced in this proceeding. And so I think this proposal ends up in the scrap heap for that reason.
This time last year when we were just starting this process and people were so concerned about it lingering on and is it ever going to end? We could be looking at a decade's worth of litigation. And this train sort of took off and kept running, and things coalesced in a way that I think sort of surprised even the people who were involved. We got the state to sign on to the grand bargain. You had the foundation community coming together. Retirees signed off on cuts in their pensions. Is this the result of Kevin Orr's leadership? Is it Judge Rhodes' leadership? What happened?
Well, I think Kevin Orr deserves a lot of credit for managing the city's plan. If you go into bankruptcy court without a plan, that's when you get hung up on all kinds of stuff, and then creditors come in with their ideas and things. I talked to the city manager, and it was either Stockton or Vallejo, California, one of the other two cities that that went into bankruptcy, about how they managed it. And they went in with their city manager as essentially the receiver. They've been, rolled a lot in that process, because it's not somebody who's familiar with bankruptcy court and reorganization. Kevin Orr is a pro at that stuff. Say what you want about, some of the controversial things that have happened since he's been here. He understands this, and so he's put together a package that was defensible, that complied with not just the law, but the things that the judge had sort of signaled early on that he wanted to make priorities. And so that has moved things much faster. I think other people deserve a lot of credit too.
Pensioners.
Judge Rhodes,
Sure, yeah.
Pensioners for coming up to the table, the DIA for saying, look, we'll come up with $100 million. That's an awful lot of money to contribute to this.
Pretty remarkable.
The state, voting to be part of it. You've got everybody moving in the same direction, but I think a lot of it has to do with confidence that what Orr is doing makes the most sense for the most people.
Mm-hmm. Well, moving on this week, a big milestone for the Detroit Police Department. It is no longer under federal control. It's a journey that's taken 11 years, cost millions of dollars, and seen more than a few scandals. But on Monday, a federal judge agreed to drop the use of a court-appointed federal monitor. But can the department keep moving in the right direction? Ingrid, this is happening while this national conversation around the militarization of the police departments nationwide, use of excessive force. This is in light of what happened recently in Ferguson, Missouri. What do you think this says to Detroiters about the police department?
Well, I think it should signal some additional confidence that things are going in a much better direction now at the DPD. I think Police Chief James Craig should take a lot of credit for his leadership in trying to turn things around in the department. And like you mentioned, with obviously all eyes of the country have been on Ferguson in recent days. And I think while these are still issues in Detroit, there has been a significant drop in incidents where police fatally shoot suspects. I think the number dropped to, 18 deaths the last 5 years versus almost 50 in the previous 5 years. That's progress.
Yeah. Stephen, the DOJ says, we're releasing the federal oversight, but there are still some issues. We haven't really answered this issue of excessive force and trying to get cameras installed in police vehicles to make sure that there is this record of what's happening during stops. How important is that last piece to fix very quickly?
Well, I think you absolutely have to do that. I mean, people's confidence in the police department is, I think, I don't know that there's any statistical measure of that, but just based on what I hear from people, is at a real critical point. I mean, in a critical low. People don't, we're supposed to count on the police to keep us safe. I think a lot of people think we need someone to keep us safe from the police, and that's not the way it's supposed to be. And that was absolutely what was going on in Detroit for a long time. And so there's still work to do. Better monitoring of officer-involved shootings. The oversight for that, the record keeping for that, is really slipshod nationally.
Yeah.
That's not just a DPD problem. And these cameras in cars, also they have cameras now that can be on-body cameras, so you can see what officers actually do. I think all of that stuff leads to a transparency that's really important to restoring that faith that they're here to serve and protect, and that we don't need protection from them.
Well, and it seems like that's a really important message to send to Detroiters, to people who may be considering either starting businesses in Detroit or moving to Detroit, that this isn't just about the transformation through bankruptcy. This is really about transforming a city and supporting the residents who are already there, but also in telling people this is a good place to live, it's a safe place to live. And so
important.
how do they send that message? How do you get that message out? Is it just about announcing the federal oversight, or do other steps need to be taken? Ingrid?
I think it's definitely a good sign. Get that news out there that the department no longer needs that federal oversight. I think that should help gain back some confidence that's been lost over the last decade or more. So, but I think it's a positive direction.
Stephen, you get the last word on this.
You have to do more. I mean, we have made a lot of progress in Detroit, and the numbers reflect that. But I think the relationship with the community is still frayed very badly, and you've got to restore that confidence. Some of it is about bringing crime down. Some of it is about being more transparent and more inclusive of communities in the way that they're policed.
Well, I want to thank you both for being here this evening. That's all the time we have for MiWeek. You'll also find us on Facebook and Twitter, and check out MiWeek.org for the shows you may have missed. For all of us here at Detroit Public TV, I'm Jen White. Enjoy your Labor Day weekend and join us next week.
Recently, Michigan's economy has begun to turn around. Michigan's gained over 250,000 new jobs. We've paid off $20 billion in long-term debt. And our population is increasing for the first time in a decade. But to make Michigan a top 10 state, there's still plenty of work to be done. Step up and help put Michigan on top. Learn what you can do at MichiganTurnaroundPlan.com.
Funding is also provided by Delta.